r/ProRevenge. Posted by user, Swabby. CEO, voids a verbal agreement. Enjoy the new union. Hey all. This is a long story that spans several years, but I look back at the outcome with fondness. 25 years ago, I worked 7 nights a week as a driver, subcontracted to the local newspaper to deliver bundles to stores and carriers. At 18, I was the youngest driver with his own route, having first been brought in by a family friend when I was 16, as a spare driver, then moving up. My days were at college studying comp sci or working computer repair jobs. Verbal agreement gets voided. The rural route I was offered had the greatest number of KMs, with a relatively lower number of newspapers compared to other routes. I made an agreement with the manager, bought a heavy-duty cargo van which had been converted to run on propane, far cheaper back then got to work. Most other trucks would not have made a profit doing this route. After several months on the job, I was called into the office by the CEO of distribution company, who was mad that I had been getting paid more for my KMs, in comparison to other in-city routes. The manager backed me up, saying he had okayed the rate, to balance out the longer hours with fewer bundles. The CEO yelled at the manager in front of the whole office and asked if there was a signed contract to state the agreed terms. When the manager admitted it was a verbal contract, the CEO said it then didn't count and was void. I get organized. Stuck with having to pay off the cargo van, and I really did enjoy the job itself, I kept at it. But documented everything, including all negotiations, calls asking me to come early, requests to set the order of my route, times waiting at the press, times entering/leaving loading bay, who was before and after me, route completion times, return home times, fuel costs, KMs driven, and press breakdowns. 6 months later I wanted to take some time off but was refused. None of the company spares would agree to do my route since it cost them too much in time and fuel. Working 7 nights a week gets draining. I threatened to quit and the company relented, agreeing to pay the spares more, but not me. This situation made me madder than ever and I started reading. I get organizing. I learned of the magical difference between a dependent and an independent contractor and how a dependent contractor is granted many of the same rights as employees, like overtime and holiday pay. I knew this was a temporary job for me, but I was pissed enough to devote a large amount of my time to make the owner pay. I filed a comprehensive personal employment standards complaint, using all those records I had been keeping, plus I offered my records to around 10 other drivers who followed my lead, into filing their own complaints. A key part of my records was proving how much control the company had on how we performed our jobs. Talk of unionizing was always in the background, but it was at this point I joined the cause with a fervor. We attracted one of the country's largest unions, who devoted a fair amount of resources to backing us even before they were voted in. My records went to the union, who referred to them consistently. Because I had years of spare experience, I also had in-depth knowledge of many of the other routes and the lopsided pay. I helped convince several of the other drivers to join up, including some of the spares. Forming a union is a long process, so be aware there were multiple votes interspersed, with the events below with each vote favoring the union position. There were also several other enthusiastic organizers who were tired of how things were. The company fights back. The company played hardball and went after us on multiple fronts. A number of union-friendly spares were fired, drivers lost their routes due to strategic amalgamations, and I was let go under the excuse that I had less seniority than the CEO's son-in-law, who had worked as a spare a couple of times over the last few years. My own departure didn't last long. The newspaper itself demanded I be put back on my route following major problems, and delays from the son-in-law doing it, bad drops, loads of complaints by carriers and customers. The union filed complaints to the labor board calling it obvious union busting. I filed a complaint to the Employment Standards Tribunal, which had been set up for my personal case. Since the company had played the seniority card, it was determined I had greater seniority than a number of company men, given I had worked as a spare since I was 16. The labor board said I should be given the opportunity to bump any of those with less seniority and take their route. Both the company and union asked me not to pursue this if I agreed to an immediate increase to my current route and to be paid for all days missed. I agreed. Negotiations pay off. Now 2 years later from the start of my story, negotiations were still ongoing, but several interim agreements had been reached. A universal pay algorithm was agreed on, with drivers receiving back pay to when the negotiations started. I received one of the biggest checks. One thing I did not agree to, was to let the union negotiate away my employment standards complaint. I was the lone holdout here, so as such I had equal standing in some labor board tribunals with CEO and union negotiators. I will always relish the disdain the CEO had for me at those meetings, to the point of placing his briefcase on the negotiating table to block my view of him. And me reclining back ever so slowly in those nice comfy chairs to grin at him while offering water. The Employment Standards Tribunal determined, I was a dependent contractor. They awarded me everything I had asked for, and more, including penalties and interest. They made a point to mention how egregiously the company had behaved after the complaint had first been submitted. The dependent contractor determination greatly strengthened the union's position for future negotiations. I move on to my career. And stake. I quit shortly afterwards since I had finished with college and was full into the tech world. It did take a couple more years for the company to finally agree to pay the full amount awarded. The CEO delayed it as long as he could. Every few months I refused lowball settlement offers. That final check with his personal signature paid off my student loans and a steak dinner. TLDR. CEO voids a verbal agreement. I get documenting, get fired, get rehired, when employment standards case, and help bring in a union. I also eat steak. Posted by user Paul Magnus. I caused my wife and I to lose contact with 90% of her relatives, over my decision to stand up against an elderly relative's abuse. Years ago, I married into a family that is both very large and very conservative. It was in another country, and I won't reveal which country for reasons of privacy. In this family, every second or third cousin was as close as a first cousin, and there was an abundance of them. And the family's elder members were held in high esteem. Almost to the point where they were infallible. There was one man in that family I came to despise. He was the brother of my wife's grandmother. And he lived right around the corner of our house. He was a simple man, not particularly well-to-do, although his house was quite pretty. A widower, he had married again to a woman who was, herself, on her second marriage. He had adult children of his own, stepchildren and some very young children, a baby and a toddler, with his new wife. The man was very pious teetotaler. Member of the Adventist Church. He carried with him a guitar to every mass, where he'd play psalms and gospel music. Often, we would hear music coming from his house. At first, me and this man's family were okay. I heard some bad stories, sure, but I never minded it much. I needed to give him the benefit of the doubt, I felt. So, I did. This man. Let's call him Uncle Bing, he had a stepdaughter who lived with his wife and him. They made that girl work the field of their farm nearby. For hours on end, she would have to stand in the field, scaring the birds away to protect the crops. They made her into a human scarecrow. This made me uncomfortable, but I hid my feelings. Speaking out wouldn't help anyway, my wife said. Because of cultural differences and whatnot. Things just kept getting worse. The more I found out about the man, the more it destroyed me to live near to him, and see the things he did to that poor girl. She ran away from home on 5 occasions. Each time she was found, and severely beaten. I befriended a man and woman from the village, who one day found her hiding out in the house of the woman's father. She had climbed into the highest tree and fallen asleep there. They found her in the morning. As it turns out, Uncle Bing had been starving his stepdaughter. The younger kids, his biological children by his second wife, got nice food. His stepdaughter, let us call her Cinderella. She got nothing but plain rice or old bread. On warm days, if an ice cream vendor would pass by, bells ringing, Uncle Bing would send out his wife with some money to buy the kids ice cream. Everyone but Cinderella. If she was lucky, she would get the thrown away ice cream cone of her brother, half chewed up. Or nothing at all, as most of the time they'd never even call for her on the field nearby. On scorching hot days, she would pull the little kids around in a plow, a very heavy old metal thing, and her stepfather would sit on his old lazy ass, on that same plow, as they used her as a human donkey for their amusement. Whenever Cinderella's little brother had a birthday, Uncle Bing would slaughter a pig. Members of the church would drop by the house and sing songs. Big party. Cinderella's birthday came and went, unnoticed. One year, on her birthday, my wife and I gave her an umbrella as a gift, so that at least she would be dry on her daily 3-mile walk to school. Thus, forced to acknowledge her daughter's birthday, Cinderella's mother, who was as nasty a character as Uncle Bing, decided to give her the rare treat of pancakes, which she would have to bake for herself. She baked them. But as she did so, but at the same time, they made her watch her infant sister and little brother. Naturally, the pancakes got burned. Her mother whipped her with a broom handle until the girls' cries could be heard throughout the neighborhood. This is the point where I had enough. My in-laws tried to stop me from going to the house and speaking up against a family elder, but I had reached my limit. I knocked on the door. Out came Uncle Bing, dragging his wiry body along with a wooden cane tipped with a silver lion's head. I demanded that they treat their daughter better. That it was shameful and unchristian-like, the way he treated her. That his facade wasn't fooling anyone. And that if his actions didn't stop right there and then, I would expose him to the village and make him lose face. Which was essentially the worst thing anyone could suffer out there, to have one's reputation ruined. And he held on to his for dear life. Uncle Bing told me, in his broken English, that he understood and would act better. I thought this was the ending of the story. I hoped it would be. For a few weeks, he was on his best behavior. So was Cinderella's mother. The girl went to school regularly again. Sometimes she'd hop and whistle a tune and she would hardly ever go to the farm anymore. So far, so good. But one day, when I was away in another part of the country for business, my wife called me and told me something bad had happened. Her great-uncle had threatened Cinderella very badly after an argument. There has been a lot of screaming and shouting, and the old man had waved a machete at the girl. She had tried to fend him off and he had sliced her hand with the machete. This was the final straw for me. I couldn't go to the police, they didn't care about child abuse as much in these parts, and were highly corrupt. Child rights laws hardly even existed. So, I wrote down a long essay on the man's behavior. Never naming him directly, but describing him in such a way that everyone would know exactly who the man and his wife that I described were. I wrote it, and had my wife translate it into her language. And then I posted it on Facebook. Now, in spite of the country's poverty, even in this tiny village everyone somehow had social media. Uncle Bing's cousins, his siblings and their families, his children from his first marriage and their own families, everyone had Facebook, and I was friends with them all. So, I posted it and the whole village pretty much saw, and liked, the post. People replied to it, writing in the comments how they saw other bad things being done by the man. Turns out he was very hated. I always figured he was some sort of salt of the earth, pillar of the community type of guy, but man, he was hated. And it all came out. All the nasty stories. People even wrote me private messages. One woman, a distant relative, even told me how he abused her when she was a young college student living in Uncle Bing's house. He had been 30 at the time, she had been 19. When I returned to our home, Uncle Bing had already read the letter. I think it was his son or his second wife who read it to him. He was so angry he threw into an all-consuming rage. He broke his guitar, the one he used to play gospel songs on, into 1,000 pieces. He threw rocks at our house, too. My father-in-law filed a police report. They settled things. Everyone in the neighborhood witnessed the old man's meltdown. His wife very much joined in, screeching like a banshee. They made a complete fool out of themselves. and afterwards, they hid in the house for days. A year has passed. My wife and I moved far away. We now live in another country. Over 30 of my wife's relatives broke off all contact with her, and with me, over what we did. Our step against a family elder caused us to be expelled from the family. Exposing his bad side was something they could never forgive. Uncle Bing lost his standing in the village. The members of his church never visit his house anymore. People shun him and his wife, and he has no friends left outside of the family. Within our own family, there's a clear line drawn. There are those who hate us for exposing the old man and his ways, and who declare that, since Cinderella is not a blood relative, only a stepchild, you should have ignored the abuse. And then there are those who have personally suffered in silence from the old man's misbehavior for years, who now have the courage to speak out. They applaud us. At times my wife blames me for the fact that some of her cousins won't talk to her anymore. That some of her childhood friends, who were her relatives as well, have broken off all contact. My wife's grandmother, Uncle Bing's sister, was sad at first. But she later told us, smiling, I used to be mad at losing so many relatives over this. But it's for the better. Never mind him, and his children and grandchildren anymore. I'm free. 80 years old, and finally, she is free. Her brother, as it turns out, has abused his siblings for decades. He threatened to cut my wife's grandma's head off with a machete before. Chased her around the house like a chicken for the slaughter. She covered it up, out of love for the family. Hid it for years. But now she could speak up. Cinderella was never beaten anymore. She goes to school now. For the first time in her life, she has friends. Villages watch her parents' every move. Uncle Bing and his wife are afraid to even scold her, and they never dare to raise a finger to her again. Thank God. That's all I wanted to achieve. It was worth facing the family's wrath over. At times I feel a bit weird. The strong position I took meant my wife lost some of her close relatives for good. She can never message them anymore. Never call or visit. They blocked her from all social media. She is dead to them for standing by me through this whole ordeal. There have been times when even my wife told me, she sometimes regrets how we played things. Because she lost some people dear to her, saving a girl she hardly even knew. In the end, she stands by what we did and feels that we did the right thing. TLDR, I exposed the abuse of a poor girl in my wife's family. By exposing the man who did it, I saved the girl, but it cost my wife her cousins, many of her uncles and aunts, and her childhood friends. If you like these stories, hit that like button, and leave a comment below. You can upvote these stories by pressing the links in the description. If you want to hear more stories from me, hit the subscribe button, and press the bell icon to be alerted when a new video is posted.